It makes sense that people using their minds to try to understand reality and knowledge and morality would also use their minds to seek an answer to questions about the ultimate questions. Where do we come from? Where are we going? Um, who's responsible for there being a universe? And to what degree do we account ourselves to someone else besides ourselves? And that gets us into a topic called the philosophy of religion. And so we'll start here by looking at some of the arguments that have been made for and against the phrase, there is a God, or does God exist? And we'll see some arguments for God's existence, and we'll see some arguments against God's existence. We can look at arguments for God's existence in four categories. Cosmological, that is, if you study the creation, the universe, you'll see that there's a God. Moral arguments, how do you derive right and wrong from what merely is the case? Those that don't think that can happen may have a moral argument for the existence of God. A prudential argument, in other words, one that makes for good betting and is in your self-interest. And then experiential arguments. I've had an experience and I believe that God was behind it, and that's one of the reasons I believe he exists. That would be that person's way of pointing that out. I'll tell you some more about that. With the cosmological arguments, we have the term Greek cosmos for the world. And if you study the universe, you'll find the existence of God to be virtually certain, or at least extremely probable. Thomas Aquinas is known for his arguments in that favor, and so is William Paley. And then there's a modern version of this called the anthropic principle, that Earth is a privileged planet that seems to have been made for us to inhabit. Now, Aquinas, who didn't wear a little happy face on his front, I put that on just for fun, is famous for having proposed 5 ways to argue for or against the tenet, there is no God. So he's always assuming there's an opponent. And the argument from change to a prime mover is one of those things. If we say that everything is in a state of change, was there a time that started the change? What started the change? The prime mover. And Aquinas is interesting in that he adopts much of Aristotle's thinking through a Christian biblical lens in order to answer some pretty heavy philosophical questions. There's also the idea that the argument from cause and effect to a first cause is. Now, that means that everything that's happened has been caused by something else prior to it. And a modern version of this has come about as we've recognized that every effect is the result of a qualitatively and quantitatively greater cause or complex of causes. So if we took a chalkboard and we wrote the letter E for effect, and then we had an arrow pointing to it, and to the left of the beginning of that arrow, we put a C for the word cause or complex of causes, that C would have to be a little bit larger than the effect, because there's no perfect transaction. There's always some wasted energy in every transaction. So you can imagine, if we go back in time, if we draw that lines of effects back to their prior causes, that would be an effect now is back to its prior cause and causes. You would see, if you go back in time and you seek to determine a line, if you pretended that it would go back into eternity past, how large would the C, how large would the cause be? And a modern understanding of second law of thermodynamics is that would be an infinitely large cause. And Aquinas would respond with, and this we call God. In fact, that's his response to each one of these. That's his concluding thought. The third one is the argument from contingent beings to a necessary being. And we've already talked about this, that each one of us is a contingent being. We happen to be here because our parents happened to get together and create us, and somebody created them. And so as we recognize, everything we look at seems to have been here because of something else and could just as easily not have been. And a contingent being is something that doesn't necessarily have to exist. I've got a stirrer here that I use for a variety of purposes, and I could imagine a world in which this particular stirrer never existed because somebody didn't show up to work, or they ran out of wood, or the machine broke down, or something like that. If I can say that about everything, then the possibility, if we go back in time, exists that every being could have not existed. Well, what if that possibility happened? That is, the possibility that every being reaches its non-existence possibility. Then there would be nothing now. If all beings being contingent means they could have not been. What if that all came together at one point in history in the past? Well, if it did, then we wouldn't have anything today, but we do have something today. So there must be a necessary being that cannot not exist. And that's the argument from contingent beings to necessary being. The argument from degrees of perfection to a perfect being points out that everything that we try to rate or rank has a kind of a perfection at the top of it. You know, true red as opposed to the variations of red. Ultra smooth as opposed to textured and then rough. And you can imagine just about every kind of quality would have at the top of it a perfection. And that's one of Aquinas' ways of saying that there is a God who is the perfection of all possible qualities. And then the fifth one is the argument from design in the cosmos to a designer of the cosmos. Wouldn't it be foolish to act as if this cell phone, this smartphone, had no designer? It's quite a complex piece of machinery, isn't it? We can take less complex items, such as this pen, but it likely also would be seen to be ridiculous that no one designed it. It works, it functions in a certain way. If that's the case, then there must be a designer. That's how Aquinas reasoned. Now, there's someone who made a better, I think, a more interesting analogy for us to understand this fifth argument, and that was William Paley, about 500 years after Aquinas. Aquinas is in the 1200s, Paley's in the 1700s. He said, if you go out in the forest, came across a stone, where did this come from? Would be kind of a dumb question, an absurd question, especially if there's other rocks in the path. But walking in a field, if you come across a watch, where did this come from is a reasonable question to ask about the watch. And the difference is that one is a contrived or designed item. The universe seems to be designed in such a way as to provide a home for humans. This is the anthropic principle, an observation post from which humans can appreciate the grandeur of the universe. And apparently, this is the place from which you can see the most detail and the most grandeur. It's kind of interesting that that's the case that astronomers have discovered. And it seems to be designed in a way as to teach us something. The deep intelligibility of nature, upon which science depends, is the result of intelligent design. These philosophers and scientists would concur on that. Another argument for the existence of God is to draw attention to the moral law of human nature. It doesn't take very long before a child recognizes he or she doesn't want to be offended, doesn't want to be violated in any way, doesn't want to not have his or her rights maintained. And this points to something behind the universe seeking to communicate with each one of us. John Hick, a notable philosopher, said we live in a world of moral challenges in which the purpose is to create souls. If you never were poor or short on money, you'd never learn the value of thrift or taking care of your property. If every job came easy for you, you never had to put out an effort, you'd never learn the value of industry or hard work. If you never felt that telling a factual inaccuracy had any problem behind it, you would never learn the value of honesty. These challenges come in order to make us aware of our being made as souls, a vale or valley of soul making. And then there are other moral arguments. Here's one that I haven't been able to locate the source, but it points out the fact that we live in a world of incredible good and malevolent evil. And mere survival is not adequate as an explanation for malevolent evil or for incredible good. So there must be incredibly good beings against which a malevolently evil being or beings is struggling. Here's a prudential argument with Pascal, the mathematician and philosopher, and he said if you were a betting person, which belief has the best odds going for it? The reason he was interested in odds is because he was so good at math that he made a lot of money in the gambling halls, and people would employ him to help them make lots of money. By the way, if you're throwing two dice, what combined number are you most likely to get? And that's not too hard to figure out. The number's 7, because a 2 and a 5, a 3 and a 4, or a 1 and a 6 would give us a 7. Well, he does this kind of calculating and thinking about which has the best odds. There is a God or there is no God. And if there is no God, then the one who says there is a God will be disappointed after death. Well, actually, he won't, because he'll die and find out there's no God. And so the one who says there's no God is going to have maybe a few benefits in this life, in that his belief that there's no accountability after life is over with means he can do a few more things than he otherwise would have done if he thought there was a God or is a God. But his payoff is limited as well. Now, if there is a God, the person who believes that and lives according to it will live in a way that will reap eternal benefits in the next life. The one who says there is no God and is wrong will have eternal consequences that are negative, will have lost the opportunity to enjoy eternity in the presence of goodness. So it makes better sense to believe there is a God. The odds are better. Now, the experiential arguments, we have Leo Tolstoy, the author, and I would say good philosopher as well, and then William Alston on this. He probably dealt with some emotional issues that resulted in him going up and down. And life is only bearable when I'm believing that God exists, is something that he actually wrote about. He said, that's the only way I could keep these cycles from taking me over. I wish I had the courage to follow through with my belief that life was empty, but I don't have the courage to kill myself. For some reason, I keep going through the misery of believing there's no God and then recognizing, wait a second, the only time I have joy is when I believe that there is a God, and life becomes bearable, and even more than bearable. And eventually, he emerged somewhat triumphant from his emotional ups and downs. William Alston, a Cornell University prof, says if it makes sense to believe a person exists when you've had shared experiences with that person, then it makes sense to believe that God exists if you've had shared experiences with God. That's interesting. And most people who talk about the experiential arguments for the existence of God will point to an experience in which they believe that God intervened, or God set it up, or God answered prayers, or God healed, or God forgave in a way that seemed, if not impossible, highly unlikely. And therefore, I believe there's a God because I feel like I've experienced it. There is an issue with the experiential arguments that the other arguments don't have, and that is if you haven't had that experience, it's not going to be very convincing to you. but it's very convincing to the people who have had those experiences. So Alston says, if it makes sense to believe that I've had a person of John Smith that exists, and I've had shared experiences with John Smith, then it makes sense to believe that God exists if I've had shared experiences with God. Now we look at some arguments for the non-existence, or the statement God does not exist, or the statement there is not a God. And these fall under 4 categories as well. The empirical argument, we remember from talking about epistemology that there's 5 basic ways people go about knowing things. At least the first thing that they refer to would be one of these 5 things: the senses, reason apart from the senses, intuition, kind of a mystical approach, pragmatic, this is what works, and authority. I trust the person who said it was true. Well, the empirical argument is based on the idea that everything that one believes to be knowledge should be rooted in experience of some kind. And Antony Flew was one of the famous philosophers who taught this. One of the most reproduced and read philosophical short articles is The Invisible Gardener Story. And Antony Flew proposed a garden in which 2 people walked. It was unknown who was the gardener. And as you looked for existence of the gardener, you could never find the actual gardener, yet there's this beautiful garden. So he asked the question, and Antony Flew is a famous empiricist philosopher. Just how does what you call an invisible, intangible, eternally elusive gardener differ from an imaginary gardener, or even from no gardener at all? What would you have what would have to occur to constitute evidence that would be a disproof of the existence of this gardener? And he points to the fact that many who are theists, believers in God, will interpret all evidence, even evidence to the contrary, as nonetheless there still is a God. Antony Flew lived his whole life as a empiricist and atheist philosopher until close to the end of his life, in which he was asked to appear on a panel with regards to DNA. And when faced with the complexity, the elegance, the incredible design elements of DNA, he came to conclude that there is a God. In fact, he wrote a book to that extent. But that doesn't mean that the others that have the empirical argument have done the same. There's a linguistic argument. How can we talk about God in a way that makes sense of the statement, there is a God? What do we mean by that? Because if we talk about there is a sheet of paper that's an invoice, that can be talked about in an empirical sense. It can be talked about in an existential sense, because I'm experiencing its existence right now. There are a lot of things I can say about it. I can speak about the qualities that can be determined about this invoice. But how can you do that for an immaterial being? How can one understand that this being speaks or communicates messages? And the difficulty of answering that constitutes an argument against believing there is a God, since it linguistically is difficult to pin down. At least that's how that argument goes. And then there's the evidential argument. Scientists who have looked at evidence in the universe have concluded, obviously in disagreement with Aquinas and William Paley and the anthropic principle people, well, wait a second, the universe is just like it would be expected if there were no God. And Sam Hawkins and Harris and Richard Dawkins, along with Victor Stenger, have sold a lot of books with their belief that the evidence doesn't warrant belief in the existence of God. So you can see that the roots of a debate going on there. But to be honest, as I've done my reading and as you do your experiencing of life, I think that those who believe there is no God will oftentimes, maybe more often than any other time, any other reason, resort to the fact of the problem of evil. And there's the names of some scientists or philosophers who have spent a good deal of time arguing for the problem of evil. Now, you say for the problem of evil, we'll have to look at what the problem of evil is before we can understand that. Now, as we look at these particular issues, it doesn't suffice to dismiss with a shrug the arguments of atheists with, hey, they're all going to hell anyway, so we have to pay attention to them. No, that's not rationally acceptable. And it also doesn't suffice to dismiss with a shrug, oh, they're afraid of going to hell, so they won't listen to reason, the arguments of theists. We should evaluate those truth claims, and you have an opportunity to do so in some thoughts about the problem of evil. Another presentation, I'm pointing you to be sure to view that PowerPoint. So what is the problem of evil? Why do bad things happen to good people? And we'll see that the problem isn't that bad things happen, but the problem is this. How do we bring these three statements together in one head? God is all good. God is all powerful. Evil exists. The question is, well, why? Now, those who believe that they're stumped by the problem of evil will say either God isn't all good or God isn't all powerful, getting rid of one of the first two of these statements. And they ask, why should I believe in a being who either isn't strong enough or good enough to put an end to evil? Well, how have humans tackled this problem? And one thing is the atheist approach. There is no such being. Or agnostic, he can't be known. So they will admit the third premise, evil exists, and we just must find answers to reduce the effects of bad moral choices. We must take accountability. We shouldn't be blaming a devil or wait for help from a non-existent God, because either life's a be and then you die, or life is what you make of it. Some others have said, wait a second, are we right in concluding that God is all good? And different religions have proposed the idea that God isn't all good, that there's a bunch of good gods, a bunch of bad gods, kind of like superheroes with problems, And they're always struggling between good and evil. One approach that is held by some theologians is, you know what, God isn't all powerful, and he needs our help to bring about the final defeat of evil. And that's how they deal with the problem of evil. They get rid of the God is all-powerful premise. And then there are some that have said evil doesn't exist. And certainly the idea of right and wrong is an illusion, they would claim, that there is just the one. There's only one category and only one thing in it. And it can't have an up or down, a right and a wrong, an inside or outside, back or front, right or left. It's all just one. It is humans that have bifurcated that one thing into illusory categories. And so our goal is basically just to quit believing in good versus evil, find the God within the one, and everything will be okay. Now, these are strategies to deal with the problem of evil. Major religions have, throughout history, dealt with the problem of evil in a way that affirms the truth of God is all good, God is all powerful, and evil does exist. And one of the greatest ways is by using the free will defense. That moral evil is a necessary condition of humans having free will. What would it be like if you lived in a world that had no possible negative consequences? And you think about that for a bit. What would it be like? Would you have ever learned to walk if crawling on your belly on the carpet or the floor was not perceived as being less good than standing and then running? Would you have ever learned to walk? Why would you have bothered if it's not bad to lay on your stomach on the floor? Or even to scream until somebody picks you up. If that's not worse than, self-ambulating, walking around on your own, why would you ever learn? And the idea there is that consequences are necessary in order to bring about growth, and moral consequences are necessary in order to bring about souls that have worth beyond their physical existence. That sounds kind of like the veil of soul-making defense. Now, here's an issue with this. If we're going to account for evil by saying, well, it's humans have to be able to choose and they have to be able to make bad choices, that somewhat answers the question of moral evil, although there had been philosophers, in fact, I worked with one who said, why couldn't God just give us a toothache? I mean, rather than, incurable diseases and other things, why doesn't God just give us a toothache? Isn't that enough to get our attention? I kind of chuckled at that one because I've had toothaches, and yeah, they do get your attention. And then the non-moral evil issues is, what about the things that happen that have no connection to moral choices, such as a volcano erupting? Now, the fact that people died because they lived too close to it, that would be a moral choice. But what about those that could, live far enough away and still couldn't escape, like the people that lived in Pompeii? And Mount Vesuvius exploded, and it's like, boy, they've been captured in lava. I doubt that they were tempting fate. They may have even thought they were living close to a god with that volcano there. But nevertheless, what about them? What about pestilence? The Black Plague. What about that? It's caused by a little microbe within the intestines of a flea that lived on rats. Everybody who got this is a result of bad choice? I don't think so. So how do you account for that? And people like John Hick will have said, yes, these kinds of things that are called absurd evil, rather than basically they're there in order for us to cause us to grow spiritually. Now let's look at evil just for a bit. As we think about this, Augustine, the philosopher of the 400s, it made a great difference in the development of Western civilization for about 1,000 years, said all God's creations were good, and some goods were higher than other goods. And angels and humans have the ability to choose, and sometimes they choose the lower goods instead of the higher goods. And that brought about a condition of evil. Then he said, wait a second, evil's existence is not independent. Now, this doesn't make for good horror movies in which we depict evil as, kind of some black cloud that's stalking and having its own independent existence. But basically, evil, Augustine questioned, is the privation or the being deprived of good. I thought that's interesting. I think it's something you should consider as well. Evil is to good as darkness is to light. Is there actual darkness, or is darkness merely the absence of light? Evil is to good as death is to life. Is there such a condition as death that has its own characteristics, or is simply the ending of life processes in an entity so that it no longer exists as that organism? When those processes stop, life ends, and that condition we call death. And that gives us an idea here that perhaps what he's doing is attacking the idea of evil existing by making it more understandable. He said evil parasitizes the good. It lives off of the good. And a parasite's existence is never of a higher order than its host's existence. Now let's think some more about this. Aquinas would say, God existed first. His Christian theology is obvious there, and God is good. Again, his Christian theology. Evil entered creation when will was misused, and the main problem humans have is an ethical issue. Wills are perverted or distorted. Can we appreciate good without there being evil? Some would say, well, not in this world, and maybe I would agree with that, but I also believe that for many there's an existence in which there's no evil, and there'll be no hint of evil, no more tears, no more death, no more sickness, no more poverty, and good will still be greatly appreciated. We won't need the contrast in order to appreciate the good. Now, one of the biggest problems with evil, of course, is that it hurts. There's suffering. And that can be seen as one way of describing evil. Evil has a lot of D words to help describe it: destruction, disaster, disease, distress, distraction. And those things all occur when there is suffering. So when we think about suffering, perhaps one of the reasons why the problem of evil bothers us is because we see somebody suffering, we can't figure out what did they do to deserve this. And so we say, maybe, hey, if there wasn't suffering, if there was a God that loved us, there would be no suffering. And that gives you the idea that the presence of suffering indicates the absence of God. And that's a valid open question, isn't it? Does the presence of suffering indicate the absence of God? If so, does the absence of suffering indicate the presence of God? Now we can think of examples in each category in which doesn't seem to fit an affirmative answer to either of those questions. So with the second one, would a person who lived a carefree life of great abundance, perhaps an heir of a great fortune, and who dies peacefully in his sleep, would that mean that he was definitely in the presence of God throughout his entire life? He may have made some very wicked choices, but he never suffered. So can one say that? I don't think so. I think we'll want to hold out that suffering and the presence of God may not be that causally related. And when people do suffer, do we think it's because there is no God? And we have so many people, and I taught biomedical ethics, so this has kind of been made real to me through many anecdotal stories of people who discovered character traits they didn't know they had until they had to deal with a disability or a disease. It's like, boy, I've grown to a level I never could have if this hadn't afflicted me. Well, if neither of those statements can be affirmed, with an unqualified answer, then suffering and God being here or not here are not necessarily related causally. And that removes part of the objection against the fact that evil exists. Now, we can apply this a little bit further. Should all who die painfully go to an eternity of pleasure and bliss, so they get paid off for their pain? Including those who, basically died after abusing large groups of people. They died painfully. Should they go ahead and have a pleasurable final existence, such as Adolf Hitler, or concentration camp commandant, or Mao Zedong saw to the death of 50 million Chinese people in order to make China communist. And that's the cost that it takes to become communist in China. So the end justifies the means. If there is an eternity, should Mao Zedong then therefore enjoy it? Well, we have a problem here. Should all who die painlessly go to hell? And obviously, that would also get a no answer. So maybe we should rethink the relationship between one's suffering of pain and one's eternal destiny. And that's a question to ask. And the final thing is to look at this issue of pain. You had something to read in the Ethics about the nightmares of painlessness. I encourage you to go back and read it in the Ethics module, because pain has a good positive function. It tells us when something's wrong. In fact, I've had this infection issue in my toe, and taking care of that and making sure it heals. I cannot rely upon pain because my feet are very, very numb. So it might have been better I suppose, if indeed pain is part of our physical existence, so that we will not do things that harm ourselves. I didn't do anything to harm myself, but nevertheless, I probably would have treated my healing toe a little bit better. How much pain is too much? How much pain is enough? Those are big questions, aren't they? Now, would a moral world without suffering be heaven or hell? And The Nightmares of Painlessness short story about Tanya, the little girl who never suffered pain, might give us a viewpoint to understand how to answer that question. One philosopher, C.S. Lewis, said pain is God's megaphone. And yeah, it does get your attention. And here's that veil of soul-making defense. John Hick is the one who's famous for it. Is God a zookeeper or a loving parent? Is God's role merely to provide for our survival needs in the way that a zookeeper would provide for the survival needs of one of the animals in the cage? Or is a loving parent, and that is guiding children to learn how to make good decisions, allowing them to experience consequences of their choices, both good and bad, so that they internalize the moral characteristics of the parent and learn to live in a way that is wise. And then the final question about pain is, does God feel pain? And there's some thoughts about that. So I hope this is something that has been helpful for you as we've looked through the question of, is there a God? And looked at both the positive, affirmative answers to that question and some of the negative answers, and then some of the really big reasons why this question comes up.